Hello, and welcome once again to the Global Students Introduction to the Law of the United States. I am Professor Pedro A. Malavet from the Levin College of Law, and today I will be discussing the growth of federal power and the Civil War. We spoke last time about vertical federalism, the relationship between the national government and the states. The power of our federal government has grown immensely since the time of the original passage of the Constitution, and there are significant historical moments that made that necessary. And I would describe that there are two fundamental periods of this, up to the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War and the modern period of the usage of the Commerce Clause to expand federal legislative authority. And that will be the subject of a separate series. In this first session, we will discuss the period up to the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War. The growth of the federal government power relative to that of the states began with the finding of implied powers by the courts. In McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819, the Supreme Court found that the federal government had implied powers. Now, we spoke earlier about the enumerated powers in the Constitution, meaning that there is a very specific list of areas of authority that are given and entrusted to the federal government. But the court said that there were powers implicit in those enumerated powers that were necessary and proper to carry out the authority that had been given to the federal government in the Constitution. And indeed, there is a necessary and proper clause in the Constitution itself. It is, in fact, the last of the enumerated powers, which the court found necessarily gave to the legislative a certain level of discretion as to how to specifically carry out its express authority. Another important ruling that expanded federal power relative to the state was that the Supreme Court itself found that it had the power to review state court judgments. And so in Fletcher versus Peck, the court found that its power of judicial review, which we discussed in Marbury versus Madison, extended to interpretation of federal law, also extended to review court judgments issued by state courts implicating federal law. And the court also said that the court has appellate jurisdiction over state court decisions that interpret any federal statute in Martin versus Hunter's lessee. In Cohens versus Virginia, the court said that it had the authority to review state criminal cases to see if the ruling violated federal law, and importantly in modern times, whether there's a violation of the fundamental rights granted to defendants in criminal cases by the Bill of Rights. In addition, there was the compromise over slavery prior to the Civil War. As I've mentioned in a previous session, slavery was enshrined in the American Constitution. It could not be abolished, and it was the unresolvable dispute among the states. And as the nation expanded from the original 13 colonies, the question of whether or not these new territories would be slave territories or free territories, of course, arose. The Missouri Compromise stated that the admitted states of Missouri and Maine would each be different. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state, Maine would be a free state. The compromise, therefore, would be to maintain balance between the free states and those that continued the institution of slavery. The compromises also declared that the northern part of the Louisiana Territory would be free. This was significant because the Louisiana Territory extended over what is today the American West and all the way up to Montana, almost all the way to the Pacific Northwest. So this was a huge territory that was deemed to be free. Another part of the so-called slavery compromises was a judicial decision, one that is sadly remembered, of course, because in Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, the Supreme Court ruled that slaves were in fact not citizens of the United States, they were property, they were not people. And therefore, that the runaway slave provision of the Constitution would automatically be applied in the territory. So even though the Missouri Compromise provided that a huge territorial expansion would be slave-free, any slave lucky enough to escape there was subject to capture and legal return to their masters. It wasn't until the Civil War that the slavery issue would be ultimately resolved. Here you see casualties at the battlefield at Gettysburg, and in the inset you see the draft of the Gettysburg Address delivered by President Lincoln as that battle ended. The Civil War has a significant effect, of course, in American law. It resolves the question of slavery, of course, but it also means that the federal government, the national government, became more important, and therefore it became more powerful. The war itself began in 1861 and lasted until 1865. It was the secession of 11 so-called Confederate states that led to the Revolution, and when those states surrendered and re-entered the Union, the war was over. The 13th Amendment of 1865 ended the institution of slavery in the United States. In addition to the 13th Amendment, the post-Civil War period saw the 14th and 15th Amendments passed. The 14th Amendment importantly provided that the former slaves were in fact now citizens of the United States, therefore it overruled Scott versus Sanford, and it also established that the due process and equal protection clauses of the Constitution are binding upon the states. That means through the 14th Amendment, the entire Bill of Rights now becomes binding upon the states, particularly the fundamental rights given to individual citizens, which are included in the Bill of Rights. The 15th Amendment deals with the voting rights of freed slaves, and of course, the voting entitlement is one of the most important entitlements in any democracy. The amendments are, of course, quite significant. However, they are not as significant as they were intended to be, and the reason for that was a rather reactionary Supreme Court. The Supreme Court limited the effect of the post-Civil War amendments, which provided that Congress had the authority to implement those amendments by appropriate legislation, and that was clearly intended by the legislative power to allow broad implementation authority. But in a series of cases, the Supreme Court severely limited that authority. The Slaughterhouse cases in 1872 ruled that the 14th Amendment did not protect a right to engage in a profession. So therefore, former slaves, African Americans, could be kept from being professionals. In the civil rights cases in 1883, the Supreme Court ruled that it was beyond Congress's power to pass a federal law prohibiting racial segregation in private businesses. To understand this, you must understand the concept called state action. Basically, what the Supreme Court ruled was that private discrimination was not unconstitutional, and therefore the Congress didn't have the authority to invalidate it. It would take almost 100 years for the Congress to realize that it had Commerce Clause authority to invalidate racial segregation even in private settings, and we will discuss that in a future series. But as far as having 14th Amendment authority, the court found that it lacked it. Lastly, Plessy versus Ferguson, the separate but equal ruling. The Supreme Court ruled that it was permissible for states to establish statutory regimes of racial segregation, so-called Jim Crow laws, laws that provided that there were spaces in public areas designated for whites and spaces designated for blacks. In the American Southwest, that also extended to Latinos. And for example, in Texas, you would find signs that said, hombres aquí, men here, meaning that Hispanics, Latinas, and Latinos had to go to specific areas that were reserved for them, and they were barred from using the areas designated for whites. That was legal according to the Supreme Court because states were allowed to racially segregate, to create an apartheid system for their citizens. So in conclusion, the Civil War did resolve that slavery would no longer exist in the United States. It resolved that cancer that the Founding Fathers had been unable to remove from the American Republic. And that is significant, of course. It also had a significant effect on law, and particularly on the authority of our federal national government. It required a more powerful national government. But it was intended to be much more powerful by the post-Civil War amendments and judicial review. Decisions by the Supreme Court of the United States limited it. And it would require what I labeled the second period of the growth of federalism to resolve that particular dispute, and that will be the subject of my next session.